The Battle of Hürtgen Forest, September to December 1944. The longest single battle the U.S. Army ever fought. Brutal combat in dense forest against entrenched German positions. A story often overshadowed by the Bulge.
Welcome back, everyone. Today I want to tell you about a battle that most Americans have never heard of. It's not taught in our high schools, there are no major Hollywood movies about it, but for the soldiers who fought there, it was the worst experience of the entire war. This is the story of the Battle of Hürtgen Forest, the longest single battle the United States Army has ever fought. From September to December 1944, American GIs fought through 50 square miles of dense German forest. Over 33,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in those dark woods. That's more casualties than we took in the entire Revolutionary War. And yet, most Americans today couldn't tell you where Hürtgen Forest is or why we fought there. The men who survived called it the Death Factory and the Green Hell. One veteran said it was like being in a meat grinder. Another wrote home, "This forest is worse than anything we saw in Normandy." So why don't we know about it? And what really happened in those woods? Let me set the scene. It's September 1944. We've just liberated Paris. American tanks are rolling through France and Belgium. The newsreels back home are showing cheering crowds throwing flowers at our boys. Everyone believes the war will be over by Christmas. Our guys will be home for the holidays. General Eisenhower and his staff are looking at maps in their headquarters. They see one major obstacle between us and Germany's industrial heartland. A dense forest sitting right on the German border just south of the city of Aachen. It's called the Hürtgen Forest. Now, American commanders believed they needed to clear this forest before pushing deeper into Germany. The logic was simple. We couldn't leave German forces in our rear, plus the Germans controlled the Ruhr River dams just beyond the forest. If they opened those dams, they could flood the entire Ruhr Valley and trap our advancing armies. So the decision was made. Clear the forest, take those dams, keep moving toward Berlin.
But here's what American intelligence didn't fully understand. This wasn't just any forest. The Hürtgen was 50 square miles of the most difficult terrain imaginable. Trees so thick that two men couldn't stretch their arms around them. Undergrowth so dense you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Ravines that dropped 100 feet. In some places, the forest was so dark at midday that soldiers needed flashlights. And the Germans? They'd been preparing defenses there since 1938. Concrete bunkers, minefields, interlocking fields of fire. They knew every inch of that forest, and they were waiting for us. The 9th Infantry Division was the first American unit sent in. These were experienced soldiers. They had fought in North Africa and Sicily. They'd seen combat. But nothing prepared them for the Hürtgen. Private First Class John Carlson from Minnesota described his first day in the forest. "We couldn't see the enemy. We couldn't use our tanks. They got stuck in the mud or couldn't fit between the trees. Our radios didn't work because the tree cover was too thick. We were just walking into darkness, and all we could hear were explosions and screaming." The Germans had a deadly advantage. They were fighting from prepared positions, concrete pillboxes that our small arms couldn't penetrate. Meanwhile, American soldiers were completely exposed, advancing through open forest floor. And then there were the mines. The Germans had planted thousands of mines throughout the forest. Not just anti-tank mines, anti-personnel mines designed to maim, not kill. Bouncing Bettys that would spring up to waist height before exploding. Wooden mines that our metal detectors couldn't find. Sergeant Raymond Ganter from Illinois wrote in his diary, "Every step could be your last. You'd see a buddy disappear in a flash in a cloud of dirt. Then the screaming would start. The medics couldn't get to the wounded fast enough. Sometimes guys would lie there for hours calling for help. But the worst part? The tree bursts. When German artillery hit the treetops, the shells would explode above the soldiers, raining shrapnel down. Your foxhole, which would normally protect you from artillery, became useless. Soldiers were hit from above. There was nowhere to hide. Captain Charles McDonald, who fought there with the 2nd Infantry Division, later wrote, "The forest was a green cathedral of death. The trees themselves became weapons against us." By the end of September, the 9th Infantry Division had advanced maybe 3 miles. They'd lost over 4,500 men, killed, wounded, captured, or simply missing in those dark woods. That's nearly half the division's combat strength. And they'd barely made a dent in the German defenses. The Army pulled them out and sent in the 28th Infantry Division. The 28th Infantry Division was a National Guard unit, mostly boys from Pennsylvania. They called themselves the Keystone Division, after their state. These guys had fought across France after D-Day. They'd helped liberate Paris. They were good soldiers, but they were also exhausted. Their mission: take the town of Schmidt, a small German village that controlled access to the Ruhr dams. It was only about 7 miles into the forest. 7 miles. The commanders thought it would take a week, maybe 2. It took 2 months, and the 28th Division was destroyed in the process. Private First Class Francis Aspinwall from Pittsburgh kept a journal. On November 2, 1944, he wrote, "We started moving into the forest this morning. The trees are so thick it's like walking into a cave. The guys are quiet. We all know this is going to be bad." The 28th Division attacked on November 2nd. For 3 days, they fought yard by yard through the forest. The Germans contested every tree, every foot of ground. Machine gun nests, snipers tied into the treetops, artillery that never seemed to stop. On November 4th, elements of the 28th Division actually reached Schmidt. For a moment, it looked like success. They'd taken the objective. Then the Germans counterattacked. Panzer tanks came roaring out of the forest. German infantry, supported by artillery, hit the exhausted Americans from 3 sides. Our boys tried to hold, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and running low on ammunition. What happened next became known as one of the worst small unit disasters in U.S. Army history. The 112th Infantry Regiment, over 2,000 Pennsylvania boys, was cut off and surrounded. Some units tried to fight their way out. Others surrendered. Many just disappeared into the forest. Lieutenant Paul Bosch, a company commander from New York, later described the retreat. Men were running, throwing away their weapons, their packs, everything. Officers couldn't stop them. It wasn't cowardice. These were good soldiers. They'd just been through hell, and they'd reached their breaking point. By November 9th, the 28th Division had to withdraw from Schmidt. They'd lost over 6,000 men in 1 week. Some companies that entered the forest with 200 men came out with 20. The division was so badly mauled that it had to be pulled completely off the line for rebuilding. And we still didn't control the forest. The Army kept sending divisions into the Hürtgen: the 4th Infantry Division, the 8th Infantry Division, the 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red One that had landed at Omaha Beach. Every division that went in came out broken. The conditions were beyond brutal. November in that part of Germany is cold and wet. The forest floor turned into thick mud. Soldiers' boots would get sucked off their feet. Trench foot became epidemic. Soldiers' feet would literally rot from being constantly wet and cold.
There was no hot food. Resupply couldn't get through the dense forest. Men ate cold K-rations when they could get them. They filled their canteens from shell holes and streams, drinking water contaminated with blood and chemicals. Sleep was impossible. You couldn't dig a proper foxhole because of the tree roots. German patrols moved through the forest at night. Artillery fell randomly at any hour. Soldiers would go days without sleep until exhaustion became another enemy. Private First Class Clifford Ingersoll from Ohio wrote to his sister, "I don't know how to explain it to you. We're always wet, always cold, always hungry, always scared. You can't see more than a few yards in any direction. You don't know where the enemy is. Your buddies are getting killed by mines you can't see, by artillery you can't hear coming, by snipers you can't find. I've stopped thinking about going home. I just think about making it through the next hour." And the psychological casualties were as bad as the physical ones. Men who'd been rock-solid soldiers for 2 years suddenly broke down. They'd start shaking and couldn't stop. They'd curl up in their foxholes and refuse to move. The Army called it combat fatigue or shell shock. Today we'd call it PTSD. One battalion commander reported that he was losing more men to combat fatigue than to German bullets. The human mind simply wasn't built to endure what these soldiers were going through. By late November, American commanders were finally starting to question whether taking this forest was worth the cost. We'd committed over 120,000 soldiers to the battle. We'd suffered over 33,000 casualties, and we'd advanced maybe 10 miles. But the battle wasn't over yet. In December, the 2nd Ranger Battalion was sent into the Hürtgen. These were elite soldiers, specially trained for tough missions. Their objective was Hill 400, a strategic high point overlooking the town of Bergstein. The Germans had held that hill for months, and they weren't going to give it up easily. On December 7, 1944, 3 years to the day after Pearl Harbor, the Rangers attacked. They climbed the steep, muddy slopes under heavy machine gun and mortar fire. Men slipped and fell. Others were cut down by German bullets, but the Rangers kept climbing. Sergeant Bill Petty from Texas later recalled, "We were climbing over bodies, both ours and theirs. The hill was so steep you had to use your hands. Every few feet someone would get hit, but we kept going. We had to. If we stopped, we'd all die on that slope." After hours of brutal, close-quarters fighting, the Rangers took the top of Hill 400. They'd succeeded where entire divisions had failed. But holding the hill was another matter. The Germans counterattacked again and again. Artillery pounded the hilltop constantly. The Rangers held their ground for 2 days, fighting off wave after wave of German infantry. Of the 130 Rangers who took Hill 400, only 16 were still able to fight by the time they were finally relieved. The rest were dead, wounded, or suffering from severe combat fatigue. Then, on December 16, 1944, something happened that made the entire Hürtgen campaign seem even more tragic. The Germans launched the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler threw his last reserves into a massive counteroffensive in the Ardennes, just north of the Hürtgen Forest.
Suddenly, American commanders realized the truth. While we'd been grinding ourselves to pieces in the Hürtgen, the Germans had been massing their forces for this surprise attack. All those divisions we'd destroyed in the forest could have been used to stop the Bulge. All those casualties? For what? The battle for Hürtgen Forest officially ended in mid-December 1944. We'd finally cleared most of the forest. We'd pushed the Germans back. But at what cost? Over 33,000 American casualties. That's killed, wounded, missing, and non-battle casualties like trench foot and combat fatigue. Some historians put the real number even higher, maybe 50,000 or more when you count all the psychological casualties and disease. And here's the most painful part. Military historians today argue that we didn't even need to take the forest. We could have bypassed it. We could have isolated it and let the Germans sit there while we advanced around them. The Ruhr dams, we eventually took those with an attack from the north, without needing to go through the Hürtgen at all. Ernest Hemingway, who was a war correspondent and saw the battle firsthand, called it Passchendaele with tree bursts, comparing it to one of the worst battles of World War I. General James Gavin, who commanded the 82nd Airborne, later said the Hürtgen was a battle that should never have been fought. So why did we fight there? Partly because of stubbornness. Once we'd committed forces, commanders didn't want to admit it was a mistake. Partly because of poor intelligence. We underestimated both the terrain and the German defenses. And partly because of the pressure to keep attacking, to keep pushing toward Germany, to end the war quickly.
But the soldiers who fought there paid the price for those decisions. After the war, the Hürtgen Forest battle was quietly swept under the rug. It didn't fit the narrative of American triumph. There were no great victories to celebrate, no dramatic moments for the newsreels. Just months of brutal, grinding combat that destroyed some of our best divisions and accomplished very little. The veterans came home and didn't talk about it much. Who wants to remember being sent into a meat grinder? Who wants to explain to their families that their friends died for a forest that we didn't even need to take? But those men deserved to be remembered. The farm boys from Pennsylvania, the factory workers from Ohio, the shopkeepers from Illinois, ordinary Americans who did their duty in the most horrific conditions imaginable. They fought not because they understood the strategy, but because their country asked them to. They held the line even when that line was a muddy foxhole in a dark forest with death raining down from the trees above. Today, if you visit the Hürtgen Forest, it's peaceful. The trees have grown back, families hike the trails on sunny weekends, but if you look carefully, you can still find evidence of the battle. rusted metal, fragments of equipment, the scars on old trees from shrapnel, and in the military cemeteries nearby, rows of white crosses marking where thousands of American boys are buried, far from home. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest was the longest battle the U.S. Army ever fought, and one of the costliest in terms of casualties per unit engaged. It's a story of courage and sacrifice, but also of strategic mistakes and unnecessary suffering. We remember D-Day. We remember the Battle of the Bulge. We remember the liberation of Paris, but we should also remember the Hürtgen. Not to glorify war, but to honor the men who fought there, and to remember the true cost of the decisions made by generals and politicians far from the front lines. Those soldiers deserved better. They deserved better planning, better intelligence, better strategy, but they gave everything they had anyway. That's the American soldier, doing the impossible even when the odds are stacked against them, even when the mission doesn't make sense. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest. Never forget it. Never forget them.
The Battle of Hürtgen Forest, September to December 1944. It was supposed to be a simple advance, but it became hell on earth. Over 33,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing in that cursed forest. Some say the real number was closer to 50,000 if you count those who came home broken in mind and soul. They fought for every inch of mud, every shattered tree, every nameless hill, and for what? For a piece of land that didn't even need to be taken. The forest swallowed them, chewed them up, and left nothing but silence and ghosts. Those who survived carried the war inside them for the rest of their lives. Nightmares, guilt, faces they could never forget. There were no heroes there. Only men doing what they were told, trying to stay alive one more day. War is not glory. War is not honor. War is suffering, madness, and loss. And the people who start wars should be the ones forced to fight them. Never forget the men of Hürtgen. They paid the price for the mistakes of others, and the forest still remembers their screams.